For about 20 years, from about 1890 to 1910, there was a transitional style that dominated design in the West, and it was influenced by the East. It brought about a different focus of spatial relationships and composition, and affected not just graphic design, but all of the design genres. Samuel Bigg, a Parisian art dealer, was the first one to coin the term Art Nouveau. Starting in the 1860s, ukiyo-e, Japanese woodblock prints, became a source of inspiration for many artists and painters in France, and it was a major influencer of Art Nouveau. Ukiyo-e was marked by a lack of perspective and shadow, and it included flat areas of strong color, flowing contours, asymmetry, and a contrast between larger, simple, and smaller, more complex areas. The idea of white space supporting the positive elements was very huge in that design style. This is Utamaro, and notice that he uses a restrained color palette, mostly of red and black and white. Very quiet, simple, elegantly formed composition. And notice the full range of value contrast and how pattern is played against solid ground. And notice how the patterns create visual textures. Ando Hiroshige used texture, rhythm, and also a lot of flowing movement. And he was known for landscape prints and seasonal depictions, so he did a lot of summer scenes, winter scenes, spring, fall, that sort of thing. And in this particular print, notice how he uses scale and repetition. Look at the fish, the one in the foreground, which takes up most of the vertical space. Then there is smaller and even smaller, and we get a strong sense of scale in diminishment. That draws the eye into the landscape. And so, without using linear perspective, he actually creates a sense of deep space. Ukiyo-e's asymmetrical arrangements and simple backgrounds, its flat, linear depictions, and a lack of mathematical perspective were different from traditional European art. And so these elements were merged with Western tradition, and new styles had emerged. Street posters became a popular graphic art form, and they advertised and promoted events, personalities, and establishments. And in this Jules Cheret poster, notice how he uses movement and energy, puts things on a diagonal axis, uses a very strong primary color scheme, red, yellow, blue, and also note how he integrated the lettering with the illustrative elements. Grasset divided design space into zones, and he unified lettering, illustration, and pattern into a decorative page design. Notice how the subdued color and the flatness of space lend themselves to an emphasis on texture and pattern. And also look at the way his illustrative elements break the border. The entire design space becomes flat and ornamental. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec broke new ground in poster design. He designed mostly for cabarets, and he used simplified symbolic shapes, dynamic spatial relationships. Notice the extreme diagonal in this. He kind of did a shot of life. He would almost capture scenes as if they were photographs taken just of, people in general, nothing posed. It was just capturing a moment in time. And if you look at this, there's a lot of comparison with the Utamaro piece that we looked at a few screens ago. Lautrec's friend and sometimes rival Theophile Alexandre Steinlen, I think I pronounced that correctly, was a prolific illustrator who depicted the ordinary person, very often poverty, exploitation, and a lot of the working class. And his commissions included magazine covers, book illustrations, sheet music, large posters. Notice how he uses scale, larger figures, smaller figures, and works the type around the figures. So the type is not actually integrated with the illustration, but it supports and frames. The designer whose working style became the primary representative of Art Nouveau was Alphonse Mucha, a Czech artist. His dominant theme was a central female figure surrounded by stylized forms, shapes, and everything derived from plants and flowers. He also was influenced by Moravian folk art, Byzantine mosaics, and other exotic patterns. Mucha's women were idealized archetypes, and they had no expression. They had no specific age or nationality, historic period, or even emotion. And they were calm, serene, and the thing that activated them was their hair patterns, which flowed freely throughout the design space. In England, the Art Nouveau movement was primarily concerned with graphic design and illustration. In addition to the sources already mentioned, English Art Nouveau was influenced by Gothic art and Victorian painting, so it added in other things. Aubrey Beardsley and Charles Ricketts were key figures in England, and Beardsley's illustrations combined contour line, textured areas, black and white shapes into powerful linear compositions. He used heavy blacks and contrasted with a stark white. And Beardsley was a young designer and probably the Andy Warhol of his day, and his primary influence were the Kelmscott school and Japanese block prints. And he fused those sensibilities into a style that some considered vulgar. His work was reproduced through photo engraving, and that allowed the prints of his work to be very faithful to his original designs. Ricketts approached the book as a whole entity, as a gestalt, focusing on the harmony of binding, title pages, typography, ornament, and illustration. And he was also very much influenced by the Kelmscott Press books. But in comparison to Kelmscott books, his page layouts are lighter, and his ornaments and bindings more open, a lot more white space, and had a more geometric flair than William Morris's style. And over in the United States, William Bradley was key to bringing Art Nouveau across the pond. He did a lot of work for the Inland Printer and the Chapbook. And he had a way of unifying type and image that ignited the Art Nouveau movement in the United States. Other designers and illustrators in the U.S. included Ethel Reed, who was the first American woman to achieve national prominence as a designer and illustrator. There was Edward Penfield, who was art director for Harper and Brothers Publications, and Maxfield Parrish, whose illustrations expressed a romantic and idealized view of the world. In Germany, Art Nouveau was known as Jugendstil, or youth style, and it was named after Jugend, the youth magazine. Jugendstil had a strong French and English influence, as well as strong links to traditional academic art and a German interest in medieval letter forms, especially Gutenberg's textura type. Henri Clemens van de Velde was interested in the sensibilities of decorative and applied arts of the past. And in book design, he broke creative ground by drawing dynamic linear forms embrace their surrounding space and take up the intervals in between. And his work evolved from forms that were inspired by plant motifs and symbols, and he developed a lot of really interesting rhythmic linear pattern. As you see here in this work, the linear pattern around the type, around the letter forms, contrasts very strongly with the more fluid organic forms, yet at the same time it doesn't depart from them. One of the things about Art Nouveau was that new forms of design and art expression sprung from existing styles. So we can conclude that a new style or a new movement is a response to something that already exists. So Art Nouveau was a response to a Victorian mindset, but it did not come out of nowhere. It grew from a synthesis of unrelated ideas, ukiyo-e and organic form. So out of Art Nouveau, a move toward more geometric forms was a natural response. Over in Scotland, and also in Austria and Germany, designers broke away from Art Nouveau and went toward more rectilinear approaches. Their concern for spatial relationships and inventive forms, functionality, and systems thinking laid the groundwork for 20th century design. There was a group of young students at the Glasgow School in Scotland in the early 1890s, and there were about 4 of them: Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Herbert McNair, and Margaret and Frances MacDonald. And they together innovated a geometric style that blended floral and curvilinear elements with strong rectilinear structure. Their designs were also distinguished by symbolic imagery, stylized form, and bold, simple lines that defined flat areas of color. The architect Frank Lloyd Wright was a very powerful influence on their work. One of the tenets of the Glasgow School was that space is the core of design. Frank Lloyd Wright believed that space is the essence of design. It's basically saying the same thing. And mathematical precision divides and conquers it. The Glasgow School married tight curvilinear elements with formal rectilinear structure and included symbolism from religion and mysticism. And the Glasgow School style is marked with bold line, flat color, limited color palettes, abstracted figures. An illustrator named Jessie Marion King drew from the Glasgow School sensibility, and also, as you can see here, was very much influenced by Beardsley. And her illustrations were very unique in her day, highly stylized. And her work shows us about the importance of drawing from influences but not copying them, and creating separation between inspiration and imitation. It might be interesting, no matter where you are in your development as a designer, to think about what are your influences? What do you respond to? What kind of stirs your soul, so to speak, in terms of design? And how is that influencing your creative output? Over in Austria, the Vienna Secession, or Secession style, was formed by younger members of the Künstlerhaus, which was the Viennese Creative Artists Association. And they resigned in protest when the organization refused to allow foreign artists to participate in their exhibitions. And so the Vienna Secession, led by Gustav Klimt, Joseph Maria Olbrich, and Joseph Hoffmann, and Koloman Moser, became another counter-movement to Art Nouveau. So it kind of sprung separately out of Art Nouveau from the Glasgow School and paralleled it, but didn't spring out of the Glasgow idea. The Vienna Secessionist movement dealt with sans serif lettering, and that lettering ranged from flat, blocky slabs to fluid calligraphic form. The design also included geometric patterns. It integrated text illustration and ornament into a unified whole. It looked at the entire design space, divided it into smaller modules, and it brought focus to the concept of repeated unit forms, which eventually led to grid system design a little later on. Notice the type used as pattern and how the unit forms are multiplied and stacked, the strong geometric understanding, the muted primary color schemes. The piece on the left by Moser is a little more formally structured. The piece on the right by Roller is a little less formally structured. Coming out of the secessionist movement and in a way compacting some of the ideas of it with influence from architecture and industrial design, the new objectivity sprang forth, and it influenced architecture, industrial design, and graphic design after it. Peter Behrens used a very formalized structure, very obvious structure to his designs, and he based everything on the idea of geometrics. So he would create a modular element composed of a square, and then he circumscribed that around a circle. And so the square and circle were the basic building blocks for all of his compositions. The module could be subdivided, and it could also be duplicated and expanded to create various types of grids and geometric patterns. And it helped to determine proportions, dimensions, and spatial divisions within design. So design started becoming very complexly built. Behrens was influenced by Loweric's theory of universalism and applied it to his own work, which pushed 20th century design toward rational geometry as an underlying system for visual organization. Behrens' work is an example of how design is inspired by other disciplines, not just other movements within the design genre, in this case geometry, mathematics, and philosophy. So this is the circle in the square, and these diagrams illustrate Loweric's compositional theory that elaborated grid systems from a square circumscribed around a circle. One of the tenets of the new objectivity was that design can bring about social change, which is evidenced by the discussions of sustainability and social responsibility today. In the new objectivity, design influenced systems of manufacturing, and everything, whether it's design or its systems or its structures, is seen as being designed. The Deutsche Werkbund, the German Association of Craftsmen, advocated a marriage between art and technology. And Behrens, Hermann Muthesius, and Henry van de Velde, the group's leaders, were influenced by William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. Yet they recognized the value of machines and advocated design as a way to give form and meaning to all machine-made things. So, although influenced by arts and crafts, which eschewed the mechanical, the Werkbund turned around and embraced the mechanical and imposed design onto it. As we look at the spec sheet, notice the formal structure, the modules in unit forms, the precision of the design, and notice also how the spatial division is created by inscribed rules to create zones of information. And as you look at this, think ahead to website design. Many websites deal with header, footer, and column organization, which is divided and subdivided.